Thank you very much for that introduction, Eric, and really for all the hard work that you've put into setting up this lecture. I really do hope that I can make all the effort worthwhile here. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. It's my privilege to conclude my time here at the Linda Hall Library by speaking to you about my current book project that I've been finishing up while here in Kansas City. Before I get to the robots, however, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes expressing something that no machine that I've ever heard of, and I've read about an awful lot of them, could express, and that's that wonderfully human sentiment of gratitude. First, I'd just like to thank the library in general and its president, Lisa Brower. Like I hear a lot of fellows, I came here expecting to find just a handful of collections to help with my research, and it turns out I found a whole lot more than that. Working in their engineering society papers, which is really a unique collection, their popular tech magazines, and a number of company and trade periodicals has provided me with well over 800 images of relevant source materials that I really look forward to going back and cataloging and then inserting into pretty much every single chapter of my book. It's been enormously beneficial to work here, and I really thank the library for that. If I actually single out every single person at the library who helped me this summer, this lecture would consist of absolutely nothing but me listing names, and I don't think you're here for that. But there are a couple that I would like to actually single out. First, Donna Swisher, who's the coordinator for the Fellows Program, and she really helped introduce me to the library and really answered any questions I had, not just about the Linda Hall Library, but about Kansas City. And she has been enormously helpful to my work here. Second, Bruce Bradley and the rest of the Rare Books Room for not only really providing space and research aid to me, but really for the friendly and congenial atmosphere that made this place such a wonderful experience. Finally, and most importantly, I really would like to thank the circulation desk. As they well know, I took out between 6 and 8 large rolling shelves worth of materials, and they were responsible for getting all of those and putting them back, sometimes even when I left them out of order. And their prompt and courteous assistance and all of that was just very, very helpful. And I don't think I really could have found nearly as many materials without their aid. So thank you to them. All right. Well, now let's get to the robots. And looking around our culture today, it really does seem, at least to me, and you can disagree with this if you want, like we're living in an age that is absolutely saturated, you might even say obsessed, with robots. In serious publications, like the one here, Scientific American, tech experts predict an inevitable future built on the labor of robots. For instance, in the article you see there, that's a 2007 piece, Bill Gates, a man who's far better known for his workman-like software than his visions of the future, claimed that soon there will be a robot in every home. And in subsequent years, multinational corporations appear to be proving him correct, at least for upper middle class and elite Americans, as a number of them have released robots designed to clean floors like the one you see up there, pools and gutters, and Google, as you can see right here, recently just got statutory permission to test its driverless car out on the highways of California. Just beware if you're driving there. All right. Now, of course, not all the robots we see in our culture today are designed for consumers. And iRobot, the same company that makes that little circular vacuum robot, Also makes a number of military robots. They're not the most famous of these. The Predator drones, which you might think of as basically they're modern and more precise versions of an older technology, the so-called robot bombs, the V-1 and V-2 rockets that Nazi Germany launched on London during World War II. And actually they were called drones. It's astounding how far back this goes. In popular culture, entertainment companies saturate both the small and silver screens with images of robots that alternate between improving and destroying our world. And so in both fiction and fact, robots increasingly pervade our lives, and as technologies continue to gain complexity and power, it's really difficult for me to imagine that trend reverse. Now, for some of you, those claims might seem a little familiar. You might have heard similar ones in the 80s, the first real boom period in American robotics, when a series of companies created industrial robots. Some of you might have even worked next to one of these here. This is one of the most famous industrial robots of the period. The image here, the Hero 2000, that's a robot that's designed to teach kids about computers. And this one here is a very similar kind of device. And in the 80s, much like today, you get a lot of pronouncements about the coming age of the robot. And maybe if you're a little older, you also remember this from the 60s, when a number of, again, serious commentators made similar claims about the coming robot age. The first of these images here is of Unimit, considered to be the first industrial robot. It's not really. But it enters a GM assembly line in New Jersey in 1961. These images here are from the publication Mechanics Illustrated, which is basically a slightly more fantastical version of Popular Mechanics that was popular among suburban tinkerers and engineers. This first one here is you can't see the rest of the headline, but it's "You'll Own Your Own Slaves." It's written by a man named Otto Binder, who prior to Isaac Asimov was the most famous writer of robot science fiction in the United States. We're going to come back to him in a little bit. This one, I love this image here. This slightly, well, actually exceptionally creepy Santa Claus robot. Now, this particular one is Swiss, so not American. But there are a number of similar accounts of, I guess you could call them Santa bots, that entertained families and malls, department stores, and even street corners for some reason, in 1950s and 60s America. Apparently, and what I gather from this is inventors wanted children, and probably more likely their parents, to know that as long as they don't misbehave, robots will soon provide them with all the consumer goods they could ever desire. And I could keep going back further and further. We could pretty much do this all day. Envisioning a looming robotic future has really been commonplace since the 1920s. And the only reason you can only stretch it back to the 20s is because that's when the term robot was invented. The term entered American after the premiere of the Czech playwright Karel Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots, abbreviated as RUR, and here you have a picture from the first New York production of it. The robots here are these figures right there. They are completely biological creatures in the play. They're not mechanical. And it's only by the late 20s, largely part due to this device here, that people begin to think about robots as machines. Before that, they were thought of as assembly line workers, basically. As early as 1928, when corporate-sponsored mechanical men, like this one here, toured the country, an early automated factory opened and scientists at MIT produced an analog computer Popular Science Monthly proclaimed that the age of the robot is now upon us. This device here is known as Mr. Televox, affectionately named Herbert, after that famous, and in 1928 soon to be infamous, engineer, Herbert Hoover. And basically, this device was rather ingenious. This device is in his chest. Basically, the guy who invented it was researching how to control machines remotely. And this has an audio sensor in it. And he figured out that machines at the time couldn't really understand human speech. So he designed a language that relied on musical notes to tell this machine how to function. So basically, you blow a note on a whistle, and it would turn, say, a vacuum cleaner switch off, or an electrical substation switch off. So really, a new sort of language to talk about robots, or to talk to machines. And here you have him with some scantily clad 20s women, in a fairly typical image. Basically, what I want to say is that for every couple of years since the 20s, some academic, engineer, or journalist has heralded the imminent arrival of the robot age, only to have his or her fantastical speculations disproved by the unfolding of time. When Bill Gates predicted the robot age in 2007, he participated in a long-standing ritual invocation to the gods of science and technology, a ceremony of speculation that has enlivened imaginations, reaffirmed our commitments to progress, and perhaps, although he certainly didn't intend this, and neither did Westinghouse Company, stoked our fears. For almost a century, the robot has been one of the central symbols through which people have imagined the relationship among technology, human nature, and social organization. More than that, however, I would argue that robots have become a form of metal gods that are bestowing gifts. Think of those Santa Claus robots. Delivering justice or vengeance, like drones, so depending on your perspective. And with the rise of automated trackers and information gathering services, serving as omniscient observers of really all that we do. These images I have here from the mid-20th century, I think, demonstrate the point. The first is a statue that is situated outside the Hall of Science, the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, dubbed a Century of Progress. I don't know if you can actually see this from behind the artist there. That's a giant mechanical man, and he's literally shepherding a man, a naked, almost naked, man and woman into the future. So sort of likening it to this gigantic god. Here you have a typical image about, regarding the ENIAC, the first electronic computer from 1946, displaying it as a electrical brain that is a giant robot standing astride the heavens, literally looming over all of creation, much like God. And one thing I forgot to mention here for the World's Fair, and completely religious sentiments they're expressing, this is the motto of the fair. Science finds, industry applies, man conforms. Though a robot might be a metallic god crafted in human form, Americans have actually never agreed on whether that God is beneficent or malevolent. They haven't, it turns out, even agreed on a proper definition of the term. So when Chapek invented the name, he based it on the Czech word for forced labor. But almost no one has used the term to refer exclusively to human slaves. Similarly, any machine actually is a form of forced labor, but not every machine has acquired the name of a robot. The pulley, for instance, it works at the direction of a human being, but no one has really ever mistaken that simple machine for a robot. And so it seems to me that a robot is clearly something a lot more than forced labor. As the robotics industry emerged, engineers and trade associations did try to standardize its but they cannot really resolve its inherent ambiguity. Typically, people have used the term to describe a synthetic, usually electronic or mechanical, representation of animal or human life. Such a representation may have shared a particular trait or duplicate at least one behavior normally associated with a living being. Similarly, robots have been autonomous. They've been operated by push button or controlled remotely by telephone, music, as in Televox, the radio, or actually in some fictional cases, telepathy. And so over the last 90 years, such an expansive understanding of the robot has really encapsulated almost everything from an automatic pitching machine, like you see on in baseball training, to an electromechanical path-seeking mouse, to a Jeopardy-winning computer. This breadth of meaning is exactly why the robot has remained a significant part of American culture. Ultimately, the primary technology of robots isn't electromechanical at all. It is heuristic. It's a technology for understanding the world. It helps people, as I say, it helps people understand and interpret the technological world rather than just directly acting in it. One more complication here, and it is that robots have never really been just a technology. They've also been people, and more commonly, actually, specific kinds of people. And for a very small number of American intellectuals, the robot has been really an apt metaphor for all of human life. And here you have a couple of examples of this. This is a New York Times article by Waldemar Kampfert, the science editor for the Times, probably the most important popularizer of science and technology in the interwar period, asking, in all seriousness, is man only a robot? The debate widens. When he's in this article here, he's talking about behaviorism and psychology, but he has other articles from the period in which he makes the same claim, dealing with the beginnings of endocrinology. And as he says in that article, a man is what his hormones make him. So man doesn't have character. He's just a bunch of chemicals operating together. As you might expect, once you get computers and the development of so-called electronic brains, this idea that all people are robots becomes a lot more common. This is John von Neumann, the man who's behind the architecture of most modern computing. His famous book from the period, The Computer and the Brain, which basically argues that computers and brains are very, very similar kinds of things. So you've got this potential that we all might be robots. But the more common answer is that not everyone is a robot, but some people might be. And it's that I'm going to focus in on today. We begin, however, not with robots, but with their ancestors. And since the 20s, Americans have understood the robot as really a particular kind of person who appeared to lack some element that makes people human. And they base this off of an old understanding of the term automaton. Now, automatons had been part of European culture really for centuries, since the Renaissance, so well before the founding of the United States. And here you have just a couple of examples of them. This is an automaton duck that ingested pellets, and the pellets move through the digestive system, and the duck would defecate the pellets out. This is one of the most popular attractions in 18th century Europe. Here's a series of Swiss clockwork dolls. They're writing. These two are children here. This is obviously a woman. Also, orreries, clockwork representations of a Newtonian universe, are first called automatons. So automatons are these clockwork and wood creations that operate at the winding of a spring. And in the scientific revolution and early enlightenment, so late 17th, early 18th centuries here, European philosophers had looked to these kinds of machines as serious representations of the clockwork nature of the universe and the animal and human body. But by the time Americans had won their independence, they had lost this kind of serious connotation they gained in the early Enlightenment and become basically a form of entertainment. And what this meant was that in the United States, when people finally saw automatons in the 1780s, they interpreted them as these sort of unserious luxuries that were designed and advertised mostly to children for pleasure. So these aren't scientific things in the United States. Yet it's precisely because of that unserious connotation that automata were able to serve a really important role in American culture. There we go. This here is the first American automaton. And much like the country itself, American automata were born in Philadelphia. This is from an early Philadelphia newspaper. And this comes out in early 1788. And the way this automaton Indian worked, as it's called, was the performer, a man who called himself Signor Falcone, so he wants to be seen as Italian for some reason. He would set up this device. This is his little mechanical Indian. Not really mechanical. It's actually a human being in there. Okay. But he'd set this up, and he'd set this board 12 paces, or 12 feet in the distance. And he'd stand in front of an audience, and he'd yell out, "Where do you want it to shoot the arrow?" And the audience would yell out numbers, and whichever one he actually wanted, as long as it was called by someone in the audience, he would tell the automaton, shoot the arrow through the hole, and it would. And with this device at the center of his performances, Falcone toured the eastern United States throughout the 1780s and 1790s. But I want to focus in on is how this automaton gave an entertaining and material form to an idea common at the time about America. Almost immediately before Falcone introduces this automaton to the United States, this man, Georges Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, a French naturalist, publishes a book in English on North America. And he describes the inhabitants there. And he says, these extensive regions were thinly inhabited by a few wandering savages, who instead of acting as masters, had no authority in it. For they had no control over either animals or elements. They had neither subjected the waves, nor directed the motions of rivers, nor even cultivated the earth around them. They were themselves nothing more than animals of the first rank, mere automatons, incapable of correcting nature or seconding her attentions. The savage continued small organs of generation. The activity of his body is less an exercise of voluntary motion than a necessary action caused by want. Relieve him of hunger and thirst, and you deprive him of the active principle of all his movements. He will rest stupidly upon his legs or lying down entire days. Native Americans, much as Falcone presented them, are nothing more than machines. And so in making the shooting of an arrow the center of his performance, what Falcone did is he reduced the Indian to the pursuit of food and the enacting of violence, the most basic and uncivilized of animal needs and behaviors. Moreover, in a world where Americans still feared Indian attacks, the device offered a vision of the violent Indian as a tamed creature. The audience could literally shout orders to the machine and it would comply. Instead of shooting citizens, which was still a real possibility in the period, the automaton would shoot precisely where they directed. Ultimately, the performance offered viewers a fantasy in which indigenous people were nothing more than animal automatons whose behavior could be tamed by civilization. And so in early America, Taming the Machine, that title of my lecture, it didn't mean what you might think it means. It meant taming the mechanical bodies of other types of people. And throughout the late 19th century, Americans were entertained by many similar automatons. These are the two most famous. This is the Turk, the automaton chess player. It was invented in Europe in 1770, comes to America in the 1820s and 30s. It's also fake. That's a recurring theme of these more advanced automatons in 19th century America. They're pretty much all fake. Here's another one from late in the 19th century, a Jeeb, who goes on in the early 20th century to be a central attraction at the Eden Musée of Coney Island, the famous amusement park in New York. And so these sort of exhibition automatons almost always take the form of this kind of exotic other. Black-skinned automatons, however, were also highly popular, particularly in toys. And here are a series of images from a toy catalog produced by the Automatic Toy Works of New York City, in which they use a lot of stereotypical images of blackness. So for instance, here you have Old Uncle Tom, a very clear reference to the novel which by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which had only recently been credited with starting the American Civil War, a novel that was designed to elicit sympathy for slaves. Well, here, in these kind of images, the company is creating devices to make people laugh. And so people were supposed to wind up these little automatons, watch them do their little movements, and then laugh at them and find them humorous. You can see a couple of classic racial tropes in 19th century thought here, with the wide eyes and the large mouth there, clearly exaggerated figures. And basically what these sort of do is they take figures that were some of the most intellectual and really radical of African Americans, like a women's suffrage advocate, women's rights advocate, or here, the Negro preacher. And they mock them. They turn their intellectual activities into something that white consumers could laugh at. In a country with a political culture that always stressed that the rational thought of the mind should govern the body and the state, these kind of toys played a really significant role. In 18th and 19th century political culture, those deemed to be the most like automatons were excluded from any public exercise of power. So the people who tended to be the subjects of these toys and those performance automata were the ones who were excluded from power. Indeed, the explicit goal of the framers of the Constitution was to locate power in the hands of those individuals who seemed to demonstrate the rational control over their animal bodies. Those who are, as I say, neither enslaved to their passions nor to other people. And so in taking the form of non-whites, but also children and women, the way these automata function is they gave a material justification to the very, very real exclusions in American society. And so when consumers would buy these objects, when they would laugh at them, when they would place them in their homes or go see them on stages, they were able to visualize the real power imbalances in American society. Similar things occurred in American science fiction, and this is, in many ways, the first science fiction dime novel in the United States. It's called The Steam Man of the Prairies. It comes right out during the Reconstruction period. So immediately after the Civil War, after emancipation, when American society is dealing with recently freed slaves. And it's based on an actual real device that was made in New Jersey by, I believe, a former Civil War veteran. And the thing about the real device, though, is that the man gave the machine a white face. He used white enamel to give it an identity, really. But when they fictionalized this, they transformed him into this image here. Sort of completely black. And they also inserted a top hat, a customary at the time sign of elite status. And this is in a period where Americans are white Americans are increasingly worried that African Americans are gaining too much power in the world. And so what the way I think about this particular piece of science fiction is that it's actually, it's really a fantasy about literally harnessing African Americans who are gaining too much power, in changing the identity of the machine from white to black. What the author here did was created a way in which readers could imagine the United States literally harnessing the bodies of black Americans in order to go into the prairies and into the plains. And this kind of descriptions of robots as tame slaves continued well into the 20th century. This is another one of Westinghouse's robots from the 1930s, actually. Rastus robot. I'll skip ahead a little bit. Rastus was a very popular minstrel show character from the period. He was the star of such wonderfully awful films like How Rastus Got His Turkey or Chicken. I'll spoil it for you. He stole it. So these are films about African American men as criminals, basically. He's also the star of the cream of wheat ads, still around today. So this happy, smiling, and very eager to please white Americans, particularly children, in this ad here. And in this particular performance, or actually in all of their performances, Rastus appeared on stage, much like he does that, with an apple in his head. And this is basically a reenactment of the story of William Tell. And only this time, the bow and arrow that the engineer uses to shoot the apple isn't an actual arrow or bow and arrow. It's a beam. Basically it's a flashlight that shines a beam of light. And Rastus, in his eyes, has what Westinghouse calls a photoelectric cell that's basically able to sense changes in light patterns. And so by flashing the light, this arrow flashlight, the engineer signals Rastus to light a fuse in his head, which then proceeds up onto the top of his head where you see that there's a little bucket here. And a little miniature explosion on the top of his head then knocks the apple off. So it's this sort of elaborate mechanical recreation of the shooting of an apple off of somebody's head. After the engineer performed this little activity, he then had Rastus do a little bit more conventional things. He got him to stand up and sit down. He had him turn the lights on and off. He had him turn a vacuum cleaner on and pretend to sweep the floors. And he had him mumble a few lines. It's unfortunately what he actually said is lost. But you can imagine it might be something similar to this, what Westinghouse says. The engineer is the modern slave driver. This is what Westinghouse is telling their engineers in their internal publications there. Now, in their earlier robot, the Mr. Televox, that white cardboard robot I showed you earlier, what Westinghouse did was create an obvious caricature. Rastus, as you might note, looks really, really human. So Televox was a machine that people were designed to laugh at. And in fact, Westinghouse magnified this by having Televox, when he gained the recorded sound, they had him tell a bunch of jokes, many of which had to deal with sex. Remember those scantily clad women he was with? Well, it was by design by Westinghouse. They never had Rastus tell such jokes. They treated it as a very serious kind of machine. And they really, what they wanted to do with him was create this idea that Westinghouse's products and technology in general was really going to be the slave of tomorrow. And that idea percolates throughout the mid-20th century. That auto binder piece I mentioned before, at the beginning of it has this, in 1863. Abe Lincoln freed the slaves. But by 1965, slavery, he says excitedly, will be back. We'll all have personal slaves again, only this time we won't have to fight a civil war over them. Slavery, he says, will be here to stay. And in creating this image, what Westinghouse was doing was relying on a far wider cultural discussion of the period that really blamed industrialization after the Civil War for the present economic turmoil, the Great Depression. And in Rastus, what they wanted was audiences to fantasize about how technology could bring back a world that had been lost in the Civil War, a world that had been destroyed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. And this here image up here is a very stereotypical image of blackness from the Westinghouse periodicals that are here at the library. As you can see, again, it's the same type of caricature of African Americans that you saw in those toys earlier, and that Rastus really embodies. After World War II, however, such an image of robots really declined. And part of the reason for that is because of the civil rights movement. Obviously, the civil rights movement made such sort of images of African Americans to be a problem in American society. But it's also due to a technological transformation, and that is the development of the so-called thinking machines, or as overly enthusiastic journalists called them, robot brains. And what computers did was they enabled the dominant audiences for robots, which were almost always white, middle class, and elite men, to see themselves or people they desired in their machines. And so here we have a couple of examples. This is Isaac Asimov, really the founder of the science of robotics, and a man who's largely credited with creating the vision behind the robotics industry. This is his novel, The Naked Sun, where he's the sort of perfect specimen of white masculinity. Again, very similar thing in the 1981, I think, film Blade Runner, based on the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep from the 60s. Again, Harrison Ford, another icon of white masculinity. Again, Arnold Schwarzenegger from The Terminator, comes out in the 80s around the same time. And here at the end we have not men but women. These are the Cylons from Battlestar, the recent Battlestar Galactica. Cylons is their term for robots. And as you can see, super intelligent white women, and plus one Asian woman there. And almost all of Battlestar Galactica's intelligent androids are white, which creates a really interesting transition in the history of robots. They do have a lot more in common, though. Oh, and of course this one, who they literally whitened up to make him easily identifiable as a robot. In all of these, the super intelligent android either tries to be human or passes as a human being, something that those earlier blackface robots, they never really tried to do. Unlike the earlier ones, which always were built around challenging or creating distinctions between human beings and machines, these new ones, they challenge them. The point of these stories was to get you to think about, okay, what really is the difference between human beings and machines? All of these are generally friends, not slaves. Data is a great example of this. One of the central relationships in the show is his friendship with an African-American character, Geordie LaForge, played by LeVar Burton. But these other ones as well, they get to be friendly. This robot here becomes friends with a human. It's not so much the case in Blade Runner, but not in the Terminator, but in Terminator 2, Schwarzenegger becomes a friend of the family that he's protecting. And here in Battlestar Galactica, these Cylons become basically sexual partners of many of the main male characters. So they're friends with people instead of objects to laugh at. And increasingly, they become a kind of an ideal. Think back to those robot toys. They were designed to mock the mechanical bodies of African Americans. But in the Terminator films, they open with basically the naked Arnold Schwarzenegger. They're idealizing his body. And this image here, it's an idealization. And so increasingly, these robots begin to be seen as ideals rather than the opposite of Americans or white Americans. All right, so let's wrap it up here. And the point that I want to make here is not that some of the most prominent ways that Americans have imagined robots has been racist, although I think it pretty clearly has been in at least some cases. Indeed, Star Trek was praised for its inclusion of African American characters. Rather, my point is that how we think about technology and its relationship to human beings cannot really be separated from our much wider understandings of the differences between types of human beings. At least in the United States, robots have never really addressed the differences between machines and a universal conception of humanity. Rather, they have been a means of illustrating the differences between different groups of human beings. And so how then does this discussion tie in with what I mentioned at the beginning, that the robot as this sort of modern day God? Well, what I want to suggest is that in the early 20th century and the 19th century, putting robots in blackface was a means of limiting their power, of denying fairly explicitly one of the central fears of the modern age, that machinery was not a beneficent God, but a vengeful God that would end up destroying humanity and human individuals. Blackface robots were fundamentally a way of illustrating the essential tame nature of machinery. That's why they chose the cream of wheat guy to illustrate how machinery would be the slaves of tomorrow. When you get the shift to white-faced robots in the middle of the 20th century, increasingly you're in a world in which people imagine that through technology, they could become gods themselves. And so as the audiences for these robots see themselves in the machines, they can picture themselves as creatures who are transformed by technology into super powerful beings. And my last point here I want to make is that robots really do illustrate, at least for me, what I call the seriousness of the unserious. And you are, I'm pretty sure, aware of the idea that people reveal their true natures, not in public, but in private, and how they act when no one can see them. And I want to suggest that something very similar about professional life and popular culture. In professional situations or publications, people rarely reveal themselves or their assumptions about the world. Sometimes they do, and those few moments are cherished by historians as if they were some really precious antique. More often, however, people reveal themselves and what they believe about the world in what they laugh at, what they play with, what they buy for their children to play with. And it's precisely because popular culture is often unserious that people put down their guards and reveal things about themselves that they rarely would lay out in professional publications, like many of which I've been looking at here. And ultimately, what I like to suggest is that we can discover just as much about engineers and their culture by examining what they did for fun, as we can by examining what they wrote about in their professional magazines. What people do for fun says a lot about who they are. Thank you. If I can turn this thing off.
We can't have two microphones on at the same time, so we have to switch back and forth. We have time for a few questions. I'll come by with a microphone. Just remember to hold it close to your mouth.
Have you come up with a definition of robot, or is it that just a word we all think we know what it means and nobody can define?
Not be able to. In the book, I don't actually rely on a static definition of the term because it's changed so much over time. It's really impossible to come up with a standardized one. So I mean, yeah, I mean it's like you suggested there at the end. It's really just it's something that everybody knows what it is, but yet no one actually knows what it is. I do talk about a number of different definitions, but there's no one overarching one that I rely on. I'm going to set this up here.
As the computer gets more intelligent and more intelligent as we go along, we've had several science fiction movies where we become obsolete and they start ruling the world. Is this going to complicate the robot situation because are we going to become afraid of them as our masters?
That's a good question. Those kind of fears have been around since the 1850s. People have been saying that robots are going to come in and kill everyone. The first actual robot story in the United States is about a quote gypsy who enchants automatons with human souls, and that when they're sold, that on Christmas night they waken and slaughter Christian children in their bed. It's a really awful, awful story. You read a lot of really awful stories when you write about robots. So these fears have been with us for a really long time, and they haven't. I think they haven't really slowed down technological progress terribly much. I think they've made us a little bit more aware of some of the dangers in turning too much power over to machinery. So, for instance, you get a lot of discussion in films about the automation of warfare. And I think that those sort of cultural depictions have made us a little bit more conscious of the inherent dangers in that. I'm thinking of films like Dr. Strangelove or its melodramatic counterpart, Failsafe, or an 80s Matthew Broderick film, War Games. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. So I think I don't think it'll end up hurting us too much, and it might end up keeping us aware of some of the issues.
I'm a student here that is starting up next week. I'm a freshman year at UMKC. I'm starting up as a freshman here in UMKC next week, and I'm in the mechanical engineering program. I went to work on prosthetic limb design. And one thing that I see as perhaps being a thing in the future is not just drone warfare, but perhaps android warfare, where we send over either remote controlled or smart robotic soldiers. And I was wondering how you think that would impersonalize or affect the populace, not only of the country being attacked, but the country sending the soldiers. How would affect the war on, not in the actual battle sense, but how that would affect the minds of the people involved?
First, actually, congratulations on starting at UMKC and the best of luck to you in your career here. The I'm giving a talk at a professional organization about this topic basically in a couple of months. So it's a thing I have lots of ideas on. So I'm trying to boil them down really quickly. People have been talking about robots fighting for human soldiers in the United States really since the beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s and 1950s. And one of the things that I argue is that the obsession with developing robotic soldiers or android soldiers, as you talk about, has never really from its beginning been about protecting sort of just the physical bodies of people, but has been really about preventing Americans from experiencing the horrors of war and from actually going out and killing people. And I think there's a very clear sense that that automated killing, or people are far more willing to kill things remotely than they are personally. And I think relying on robotics. So I think that the shift to relying on technology as the foundation of the American military. That happens after World War II with the development of the atomic bomb and computers, has really made us a lot more willing to engage in warfare because the cost to human beings is so significantly less. There's a financial cost, but at the end of the day, people don't care about that. They care about the bodies and the souls of soldiers. Don't have to worry about that, then go to war all you want.
This isn't so much about the robotics as how does that differ from having the professional army versus the draft army or hiring another country's army?
Actually doesn't differ all that much from hiring another country's army, which is what we did in the Cold War fairly regularly. But in terms of a draft versus not a draft, one of the things I write about is the discussion of universal military training in the United States after World War II. And basically what I end up arguing is that technology enables us to avoid a world in which everybody in the United States serves in the military. And one of the things that I suggest in there is that if relying more on human soldiers, relying more on the actual citizens of the United States, regardless of whether or not they're drafted or volunteers, or volunteer, does make people more or less willing to engage in warfare. I don't know that it. I would think in a situation with a draft, that people would be more leery, but I'm not entirely certain about that. But very good question.
even though we don't have a definition of what a robot is, as you say, but we do certainly agree on the certain characteristics of a robot. That is, number one, they are unemotional. Two, they tend to be humanoid, although not necessarily. And three, they do what they are programmed to do, nothing more and nothing less. At the same time, we have somewhat been unable to achieve a thinking robot with those characteristics. But we have achieved the ability to convey human thought and emotion by robotic means, and that would be the iPhone, the iPad. And so we have kind of cut the head off the humanoid robot, so to speak, and we convey these wonderful emotions through this flick of the finger and the thumb with the iPhone and the the iPad. And it reminds me of John Nesbitt's expression in Megatrends in the 1980s. He said, for every high-tech advance, there will be a high-touch response. And so we have nothing greater than that now than the iPad, the iPhone, which conveys all these human, very human responses to what's going on around us through these technological means. And therefore, we have achieved a certain communication with a robot that does exactly what we want it to do. And it's well programmed, and it's not humanoid, but it conveys the human condition in a wonderful way. It's not emotional, but we get to be emotional through it.
All right, due to the time, we have a question back here in the back of the room. This will all have to be our last question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had seen Robot and Frank and your thoughts about Robot as caretaker.
I'm ashamed to say that I have not seen Robot and Frank yet. It is on my list of things to watch. I just actually defended this as a dissertation in May, and the dissertation ends in 1960. So while I was writing that, I pretty much just concentrated on everything prior to 1960, and I'm only in the last couple of months been picking up some of the more recent things. So I haven't seen that. Yeah, I mean, the robot as caretaker, there's a lot of recent literature on that suggesting actually that people actually prefer them in many ways to human caretakers. I assume that's because human caretakers tend to be overworked and can get very stressed and oftentimes can make mistakes in ways that the robots won't. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly going to be a very interesting development over the next couple of years as we have an aging population and a relatively or a far more static amount of caregivers.
All right, thank you, Dr. Abnet.